Talking about these restrictions that are going into place, perhaps no more sweepingly so than in New York City, where pretty soon you're going to have to prove that you've been vaccinated or at least testing negative when you go indoors, any restaurant, any place. Then there's the mask thing. And then there's Curtis Sliwa, who's running for mayor of New York City, the Republican nominee, who is saying enough already with this and planning to blast Mayor de Blasio in this plan, and that it's doing more harm than good. Mr. Sliwa joins us right now. Curtis, very good to have you.
Neil, this is crazy. Can you imagine that Mayor de Blasio is following the footsteps of Macron in France and the Italian government? How's that worked out over there? We're taking a lead from the French and the Italians, in which this new policy, this crackdown, these mandates have paralyzed their countries. And just yesterday, after the announcement by de Blasio, by the way, because he can't deal with the shots that really count in New York City, all of the shots being fired at people and tourists, the lead poisoning you get, not the vaccines, the International Auto Show decided it was going to cancel its dates in the Jacob Javits Convention Center, which would have sent a signal to everyone, we're back. There's not enough cars, as you reported, both used cars and new cars. This would have stimulated a lot of tourism and a lot of travel. And now the vendors are not coming. The tourists are not coming. And as your report mentioned, Amazon putting off opening up its offices till January, others pushing back to October. This will be economically devastating to the city, but it's par for the course for de Blasio, who has taken a Miley Cyrus wrecking ball to the city that we love and destroyed it in so many ways. Economically, in terms of crime, quality of life, and I guess he wants more people to continue the exodus out of here and leave and tell them, hey, don't let the door hit you behind.
Curtis, you're the first person to compare the New York mayor to Miley Cyrus, so touche there. But let me ask you a little bit about what you would do if you got elected mayor and these spikes are continuing or even increasing. What would you do?
Well, number one, you are going to follow the science. But I'm not going to allow the constituents of New York City to get vertigo because Fauci says one thing, the CDC says another thing, and then all of a sudden I'm saying a completely different thing. Got to get everybody on board, everybody focused in what is the best interest of everybody. But you cannot disrupt people's right of choice and freedom. Look at how many people in New York City, because of prevailing conditions, cannot get vaccinated, even if they wanted to. It would be a death sentence to them. People whose religions won't permit that. People who don't trust the vaccine, especially in minority communities, because the FDA has not given its sign, sealed, and approval to it. What are we to tell
Curtis,
them?
Would you support businesses? Would you support businesses that require it?
Look, a private business can make that choice, and then employees can take them to court and challenge that. But I would be discouraging that, because really what they're doing is they're delaying the return of the workforce into these glass-encased steel tower buildings that are empty. And Neil, it's something even a little more devious than everything that's been announced so far. De Blasio said enforcement would begin of this edict on September 13th. The NYPD rightfully said, don't expect us to enforce it. Who's going to enforce it? And if you notice, it's right at the time that my three sons and everyone else in the public school system finally were promised that there would be in-classroom training. And already we've seen Randy Weingarten with the National Teachers Union say, well, maybe not. The UFT, which represents the teachers in New York City, vacillating. I have a feeling this may prevent our children from going back to school. Even President Joe Biden sternly pointed his finger at the camera and said, we've pumped millions of dollars into your public schools throughout America. You've got to get the kids back in the classroom. And I think there's a lot of vacillating here. And de Blasio, once again, is leading an effort that is going to take us backwards instead of forwards.
Do you ever get angry? You mentioned some stipulations for those who personally are leery of vaccines, period. Others who just aren't sure about the ones that are out there for this. that they are ruining it, though, for everybody else because they're so dead set against it. Do you think, and as mayor, if you were mayor, would you push that people get vaccinated?
Of course, I've been vaccinated and I promote people getting vaccinated. If you look at the sort of bipartisan effort, Trump has said get vaccinated, Biden has said get vaccinated. There are very few out there who are not encouraging vaccination. We are encouraging people to get vaccinated by giving them $100. I'm sure we could raise the ante. I'm sure we could have counselors go in, especially.
Would you do that, Curtis? Would you raise the ante? I mean, some like Vanguard, the big mutual fund group, is paying its workers $1,000 to get vaccinated. What would you do?
Absolutely. I'm a believer that the more people that get vaccinated, the quicker we can return to normalcy and get back to where we were before the lockdown and the pandemic. But again, people have to make choices in America. This is America. This is not a totalitarian dictatorship. And we keep moving in this direction. You know, these mayors and governors, and thank God our Governor Cuomo, who actually abused the executive orders the most, has been rendered impotent by the problems that he has created for himself as to whether he can continue on at night. But Bill de Blasio is starting to sign all these executive orders. Again, they're drunk with power. And I say, where is the evidence? 70% of us are already vaccinated in New York City. The most vulnerable group, those who are 65 plus, 77 are vaccinated. Young people are not at that level. Black and Hispanics are not at that level. Conservatives are not at that level. So do we stop everything because everyone is not at the herd immunity level? We're getting there very quickly, but we're destroying our economy. And what, are we going to keep pumping stimulus dollars, keep spending money for those who are not working, who are getting unemployment? This is just crushing New York City, which was the city that never slept 24/7, the economic engine of the world, the epicenter of capitalism. And think about it, Neil, if you were a socialist or you believed in some of the socialist principles, this is putting us on the road to socialism, where it's total government control from the cradle to the grave, in which you have no choice. I want people to have the opportunity to make free choices with their own life.
You know, you mentioned Governor Cuomo, and he's resisting calls to resign. I know yesterday you had delivered a resignation demand to his New York City office. Have you heard back from anyone at his office?
Well, I not only asked that Andrew Cuomo resign now, and more so for the speech he gave afterwards when Attorney General Tish James announced all the evidence against him, in which he claimed cultural immunity, that it was in his DNA because he's Italian American. He saw this in his father, Mario, liar. He saw this in his mother, Matilda, liar. I've also coupled this with Chris Cuomo and said, Chris, now is the time you have to speak out to defend the honor of your father, who is no longer with us, and your mother, thankfully, Matilda, who's alive and well at 89. He's blamed his groping and his perverted ways on being taught this through the Italian-American culture, through his DNA. Neil, in the streets of Brooklyn, where I was raised, we call that udisgraziata. That is a sin against family.
But there's a lot we don't know, and you're quite right about that. I think what he was trying to say is people mistake his actions for being a touchy-feely person. I get where you're coming from, because certainly these 11 women who have, charged him with harassment and much worse disagree. This is quite different. But I am curious about where you see this going. I mean, let's say he keeps fighting this, and you become mayor. He could still technically be governor. You have to work with the governor, whether it's going to be Governor Cuomo or the lieutenant governor. How's that going to go?
Well, my adversary, Eric Adams, the Democratic candidate, and he hasn't been coronated yet, has been an enabler of Andrew Cuomo and his many ways, not just in terms of perversions and in terms of being a groper, but his threats, his intimidation. That's his style of leadership.
He has recommended the governor step down, and I know just like you have recommended that. That's not enough.
Right. Finally, but he and also Cuomo have advocated stripping qualified immunity from police across New York State. How ironic then Andrew Cuomo will now get socked with millions of dollars of civil lawsuits, rightfully so. And we are going to have to defend him with our tax dollars. He will not have to spend a nickel, dime, a penny of the $5.5 million that he made on that book to talk about how to handle a crisis in the midst of a pandemic. We are going to be held responsible for all the costs because the governor has qualified immunity, and yet he's the leader of the pack to strip it from police who could now be personally sued as a result of actions that they take on our behalf. How hypocritical is that of these officials to allow him to have his qualified immunity while stripping it away from men and women who put on a bulletproof vest and go out each and every day to defend us and put their lives on the line?
Curtis, this was the same case when you and I last chatted close to a month ago, that crime is the #1 issue for New Yorkers, the #1 issue for Republican voters, #1 issue for Democratic voters. You have been very critical of the approach Eric Adams would have to this, even though he has been saying that he is not one of those interested in defunding the police. And as a 20-year police veteran, he has a better sense of how to deal with crime than you do. What do you say to that?
Absolutely not, because he's advocated that there be no arrests or prosecution of low-level crimes. The very policy that Rudy Giuliani credited with saving this city from the abyss when he inherited a city that had 2,000 murders a year, 5,000 unsolved shootings after Mayor David Dinkins, who, by the way, Eric Adams has role modeled himself after. I've role modeled myself after Rudy Giuliani because he had zero tolerance. In fact, Eric Adams, former police officer, doesn't want someone arrested when they are resisting arrest, of which many of these individuals do in New York City, where they threaten police, they curse the police, they chase the police. They wouldn't be arrested. Fare evasion, imagine. Eric Adams doesn't want you, Neil Cavuto, or anyone to pay a fare to ride a subway and bus in New York City. How are we going to subsidize the multi-billion-dollar bill that is required to pay for the maintenance and the continued operation of our subways and buses, which is the veins and arteries of the city? You can't be law and order when you come up with such a ridiculous idea as free fare on the subways and buses where there are no turnstiles and there is no checks and balances.
This city has had Republican mayors in the past. Michael Bloomberg, of course, switched parties to run as one and served a good long time. You mentioned Rudy Giuliani, but more often than not, it's very tough. It's an overwhelmingly Democratic place. We do remember a former mayor of Peekskill, New York, George Pataki, who defeated, a Democratic lion, Mario Cuomo, this governor's father. So it does happen now and then, but the odds are against you. So people hearing the odds, Curtis, hearing you now, how do you tell them that you can buck those odds? Because the math doesn't look great.
Well, it's clearly, there's no doubt about it. You're talking about David versus Goliath in a political sense. But Neil, as the Republican nominee, I'm also running on an independent party line. That's what guaranteed Bloomberg victory for 3 terms. He didn't win it with Republican votes alone. He had to have an independence party line. I've already secured that. And most importantly, more than any other Republican, as much as I supported Bloomberg, as much as I supported Rudy, and they did a great job. We didn't have these problems in 20 years of Republican leadership. I can go into neighborhoods because of my background of 42 years leading the Guardian Angels, in which the only Republican they've ever seen or been exposed to is Abraham Lincoln on a $5 bill, and be received and respected, because I have what you can't buy in politics, street cred. And those are the neighborhoods that Democrats always took for granted, where there are projects, where there are tenements, where the poor, the impoverished. I ride the subways. I walk the streets every day. I haven't changed as a candidate. Eric Adams is too busy up in the suites celebrating his victory in the primary, getting wine, dined, and pocket line. Don't go to sleep on Curtis Sliwa. That's for sure, Neil Cavuto.
All right. Curtis, great talking to you again. Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate for mayor of New York City. It's always been seen as the second toughest job in the nation, second only to the presidency of the United States, although some days in New York City, even tougher than that. By the way, we did reach out to Eric Adams, the New York Democratic opponent for Mr. Sliwa. We have yet to hear back. Hope springs eternal. We don't fight anyone here. We don't shout them down. Anyone, everyone, welcome, fair, balanced. You know all that. A little more to this.